Hi, my name is Khoi, and today I'm going to talk to you about what heritage means, particularly when applied to, someone who has a heritage, East to Southeast Asian heritage. And I'm going to focus on Vietnamese heritage and in British people in the UK. And that's kind of what my research was on. And many of us, even in research, when we think about heritage, we don't really question the term very much. There's a lot of starting assumptions when we talk about my ex heritage or someone's ex heritage, right? And it's kind of based around this concept of sharing. In my mind, it was based around sharing something, having a shared country of origin, perhaps. In my case, Vietnam, or a shared language. And I thought, well, Vietnamese, because that was in my heritage, kind of. The language I speak with my parents and the language that they spoke with everyone back in Vietnam. And maybe a shared history as well of how you came to be in this new place. And when I started my research, well, I thought that everyone that I would be interested in would share these things. They would share a country of ancestral, at least, origin, shared language with me, Vietnamese, and a shared history. And my research is on heritage languages, and there it's in the name. And what that often means is that people speak a minority language with a family. That's why it's often called family language by some people, or with the local community, which is why mostly the government calls it community languages, which sounds a bit more positive. But what that mostly means is that these languages are restricted in their context. You can't use it everywhere. Sometimes it's looked down on. And there is a dominant language. In the case of the UK, that's English. It's not officially the national language of the UK or of England, but it's very dominant. You need to be able to use it in many contexts, in court and bureaucracy, things like that. It's certainly very helpful in almost all contexts, and most people speak it. And with heritage language, in the case of immigrants, there is a process called language shift. And that means that people, when they immigrate, they still use the minority language in more contexts because they're used to it from where they came from. Then the second generation uses it in fewer and fewer contexts, sometimes only the family, and are able to use it less as well. For example, they often don't learn to read or write it because it's not taught at school in the place where they're growing up, and that results often in the third generation not being able to use the language at all. That's called language shift. It means that the third generation isn't able to speak to their grandparents or the extended family anymore. And that's my research area. I'm opposed to this happening. I'm interested in how do people pass on heritage, particularly heritage languages, because I'm a linguist, a multilingualism researcher. In order to understand who I was looking at, there's some background on how Vietnamese people wound up in the UK. That's mostly the result of something that happened in the 20th century. First of these was the end of the Second Indochina War. The Second Indochina War was between two Vietnamese entities, North Vietnam, the Democratic Republic, and the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam. And in the end, the North won and conquered the South. And that led to a lot of people from the South Vietnamese government, military, and police fleeing. But that didn't really involve the UK yet. They mostly went to other countries that had been involved in the war, like Australia, but also the United States. What's more important for the UK context is the so-called refugee crisis in the 1980s. That was during the Third Indochina War. So Vietnam is now unified, but China tries to invade. And also there were a war with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And added to that, there's a lot of economic problems because of international sanctions and things like that. This crisis results in the UN, the UNHCR, asking other countries for help. And the UK eventually, after a lot of reluctance, pledging to receive 10,000 of these so-called boat people. That term has become a little controversial. And they only want to take them, however, from the Hong Kong refugee camps. Hong Kong at the time is a British colony, and that's going to be relevant shortly. And there's been continued migration from Vietnam to the UK ever since, because there's been some political changes in the 1990s. Right. So I'm thinking, well, a lot of people have this shared history, and obviously, in my mind, obviously have roots in the same country, Vietnam, and will have this language in their family, Vietnamese. However, I immediately noticed that that wasn't that simple. Even the question of country, right? Because as I just showed you, Vietnam wasn't one country for a little bit. Crucially, in the middle of the 20th century, it was divided into two. That wasn't relevant in my life, but it was relevant to a lot of the people who left. You know, some people left directly after the war, but everyone who left in the 80s still clearly remembered this. And also that means there was differences between the people who came from North and South Vietnam, differences that would result in different conditions once they arrived in the new country. So people from North Vietnam tended to have lower socioeconomic backgrounds, tended to be former farmers in particular, have less education that they could bring to the new country. You know, that makes life a little bit harder. And they often tended to, because they were from North Vietnam anyway, it's statistically less likely on average that they were politically persecuted. And often they maintained ties to Vietnam, even once they moved to the UK. Whereas people from South Vietnam, there wasn't as many in the UK, but still a few. They tended to come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. They didn't bring that with them, but that gives you some skills that you might not otherwise have. They tended to have more education, and that's a big advantage when you try to make a new life in a new place. And either directly or indirectly, they were persecuted by Vietnam for political reasons. So a lot of these people will be in charge of or start organizations, community organizations, but also they would be politically quite opposed to Vietnam. And that means that there's a lot of internal conflict in the so-called Vietnamese community. And other researchers also found this. This makes it really hard for community organizations to reach everyone, because there's all these antipathies between them. And you might think, well, you know, that's ancient history by now, and it is. But for people who were born and raised in the UK, all they know about Vietnam is what their parents tell them, in many cases. And so you have people who've never lived in Vietnam, maybe have never been there even, who still think about North and South Vietnam, and they talk badly about the other half. And in church, North and South Vietnamese people sit on opposite sides and things like that. So shared country is already a little bit complicated. The shared language, I quickly saw that besides Vietnamese and now English, there's a third player in the game, which is Cantonese, because it turns out over half of the original refugees that came to the UK were ethnically Chinese. So their families had lived in Vietnam for many generations, but because of ethnic persecution and other factors, many of them had to go. And it's not a coincidence that many of them fled to the Hong Kong camps. And as I said earlier, the UK only took refugees from the Hong Kong camps. So Cantonese really is the heritage language, right? So the language in the family has stayed the same, you could argue. And all that's changed to the language in society. And why would Vietnamese be relevant to them? You know, English is now the new dominant society language. So is Vietnamese still a heritage language for them? Do they have Vietnamese heritage in some tangible way? They're from Vietnam, or their ancestors were. And finally, I found something that seemed quite promising at first. There were Vietnamese Catholics in Manchester and in Birmingham who held Catholic services in Vietnamese. And they also used the resources for Vietnamese school for children in Birmingham. And I thought, well, that's not unusual for a lot of groups, a lot of languages. Religion is a key context in which the minority language, the heritage language, can be preserved, maintained, and passed down, right? So that's kind of what I was hoping. But it turns out that's also a little more complicated than that, because even though the people I interviewed did have some abstract interest in passing down Vietnamese heritage, Vietnamese culture, they were still religious figures. And one priest told me, well, the reason Vietnamese language services are necessary is that the congregation wouldn't be able to follow a service in English. That was his perception, at least. And in the middle of the service, not just with them, just with a lot of churches, this is the case. The children go to a different room to get a more bite-sized version of the sermon, right? So they learn about something religious. That's the case in many religions, and and in this room, and the exercises they would be handed would be in English. And afterwards, the priest talked to them and asked them, what did you learn this week? Also in English. And he said about this, I use the language, whichever language is easiest, right? Easiest for what? Easiest for, his actual job, which is the priest, and even at the Vietnamese school. And that, is the primary purpose is to pass down the heritage language. But even there is a class that for advanced students, that's not about language, that's about the catechism, like the core tenets of Catholicism. And that's completely bilingual. And because the priority isn't the language, the priority is the religion. So even in something that I thought was very clear cut, and kind of in traditionally in the literature is seen as like a sphere where the heritage language is passed down, more than one language plays a role, and perhaps the language isn't the key thing for these people, or the key cultural element that they want to pass down. So where does that leave us? It seemed a little concerning to me that I couldn't settle on a definition of a heritage that would still encompass what I was observing. But I tried to frame this a little bit differently, because it's not all about these divisions, right? Like every community is heterogeneous, has a lot of differences inside. But what I also saw were a lot of connections. Right, so for example, that I showed you a menu from a Vietnamese restaurant earlier. That place is owned by a ethnically Chinese woman from Vietnam, from the Hoa people. And even though her family language is Cantonese, she didn't switch to English once she opened that restaurant. Most of her clientele is Vietnamese. She employs overseas students from Vietnam and speaks Vietnamese with them. The food is Vietnamese and not some other Chinese cuisine perhaps, which would have been possible. And so both Vietnamese and English are languages of the workplace for her. And in the family, in other cases, Cantonese and Vietnamese can be the heritage language alongside each other, can form part of the same family's heritage. So next door to that restaurant I just described, there is a barbershop, and you can see it uses Chinese and Vietnamese alongside each other. And you might think, well, that's another one of these Sino-Vietnamese, Hoa people. It's ethnically Chinese, but no, that's not the case. This man only spoke Vietnamese in Vietnam. And while I was waiting in the Hong Kong refugee camp, his uncle had already made it to the UK and told him, you need to learn Cantonese in order to come to England. And that's because for a lot of Vietnamese refugees, the first places of work they got were from the local Chinese communities who'd been in the UK for many centuries, generations, not centuries. And perhaps because there was less prejudice, perhaps because they recognized some similarities, the Chinese people in the UK were among the first to give Vietnamese people jobs. And this was the case also for the barber. Now flash forward to today. He's married to an ethnically Chinese woman. And with the children, they use Vietnamese and Cantonese. And they both play a part in the family and also for him at work. He does advertise to Chinese customers. And he's also says that he wants to use Mandarin because there's more and more people come from mainland China nowadays, and they don't use Cantonese, they use Mandarin, at least the ones who come to the UK. And also, it goes both ways. As I said, the British Chinese communities were aware back in the 80s that these new people from Vietnam were coming. And they're still aware of this. Across the road in the same street, there's a Chinese restaurant and supermarket, and there it's kind of the reverse situation to that other menu I showed you, where they use Vietnamese first and then Chinese. Well, here it's a Chinese restaurant with Chinese food, dim sum, right? It's in Chinese first and then in Vietnamese, but it's consistent. And I talked to the restaurant manager at this Vietnamese restaurant, and he said, well, a lot of people from Chinese restaurants come here on their breaks to eat, And in fact, the manager of that Vietnamese restaurant that has Chinese on its menu, well, he's actually ethnically Chinese, right? He's born in the UK, so mostly speaks English in most contexts, and uses Cantonese with his family. But because he's the manager of a Vietnamese store and restaurant, he was very proud to show me that he's able to write Vietnamese for bills and able to speak it and observe this with the customers and other employees. So where does that lead us? Have we learned what heritage is? Well, I think instead of asking what heritage is, maybe we should start by looking at individuals and what they do. That sounds a little bit abstract, but what I mean is that every individual has different spheres of knowledge that they draw from, bits of knowledge that they picked up from their family, from how they grew up, their environment, maybe stories that they heard from their grandparents, things like this, right? And it's unique for everyone. However, sometimes we share some of these aspects, some of these bits of knowledge, but it doesn't fit into one box necessarily. For a lot of people, different spheres of knowledge intersect. So British Vietnamese people, they do know a lot of the things that other British people also know, right? From growing up, from going to school, from watching the same TV, perhaps. But they also might have some experiences, some memories that others don't have, that are from Vietnam or like a Vietnamese family, but also from Chinese families. And when you communicate, when you try to connect with someone, you draw on what knowledge you share, right? It's very simple with language. You draw on the words you both know, the grammar and the sounds, but also the stories that you've both heard. You're trying to make a connection. And when you try to make a connection, when you put communication to practice, it doesn't really matter which box you fit into. What matters is that you share some knowledge with the person you're trying to connect to, and you're making it work, right? So here again, there's examples for, rather than saying, that leads me to conclude that rather than saying, these people, these Vietnamese Catholics, for example, who use so much English because Vietnamese isn't as important as a religion for them. Well, they still have bits of knowledge that they share with other people. Some of those are language, right? Maybe not enough to pass a test, but that's still something they associate with church, with something that is important to them, with their religion. And the restaurant manager, who is ethnically Chinese, he doesn't use Vietnamese in his family, right? But he shares these bits of knowledge about how to talk about food and write bills and ask for change and numbers and things like that. Again, he wouldn't be able to pass a test, but he and these kids that went to this Catholic school, they share some of the knowledge, right? And that connects them. So in short, my takeaway message is that I think heritage is not something you have, and it is not something you can classify people into, someone of Chinese or Vietnamese heritage. It's something that you do and what you do it with. Right. Thanks. I hope you found it interesting.